Hi guys, Mr. Davis here. Hope you're well. This is the third of our presentations on sociology and sport. As always, we'll just start off with a few starter knowledge recall questions. Just work your way through them. There's only 4 short questions. Just make sure you've got an answer for each of those. Pause the video here and then we'll pick it up again shortly. Okay, let's tackle these one at a time. So just a quick refresher on some knowledge from the previous topics we looked at in the globalization section. So first one, who was Dr. William Penny Brooks? Hopefully that name rings a bell. You're not likely to get a question specifically about him, but you might get a question about something to do with the Wenlock Olympic Games, and he was the founder. So he was the person that set that up, and you might be able to use that information as part of a slightly bigger answer to one of the questions in the exam. So important that you are aware of who he is and what he did. Second one, what's meant by the term open era? I'll give you a clue, it's to do with tennis. And the open era was simply where professional tennis players were able to compete alongside the amateurs to earn money. So previously that wasn't possible, and certain competitions were only set up for different levels of players. So if you were a professional, you might not have been able to compete in the amateurs and vice versa. But once the open era came about, professionals and amateurs could compete together. Then a couple of definitions. First one, the definition of commercialism. And that is the process, simply the process of trying to gain money from an activity. So commercialism is simply to do with money, and specifically in our case to do with sport, trying to earn money through sport. And then the term globalization, this is a little bit more wordy. So we go with the process whereby nations are increasingly being linked together, people are becoming more interdependent via improvements in communication and travel. Again, you're probably going to be able to get away with something a little bit more concise than that, as long as you kind of get the gist of it across, that it's essentially people coming together from around the world, and how they're becoming more interdependent on each other, and the key concepts being through communication and travel. Okay, right. So as I said, the third of our presentations on sociology and sport. So please just make sure that you've got the title, learn an objective, and the key term that I've just noted down there is social action theory. This presentation actually goes through a few different key terms, so I haven't bothered listing them all here because we're going to tackle them one at a time as we go through. But yeah, learn an objective. I will learn how sociology impacts on equality of opportunity in society. Just make sure you've got that down, and then we will move on. Okay, so the first part of this is just to do with something called social action theory, and it's got a nice short definition here, which we will build on. So make sure you've got this noted down: a way of viewing socialization, emphasizing social action. What does that actually mean? Well, there are 2 kind of key concepts here that are linked to social action theory. And the clue is very much in the name. So the first part of it is that the theory is to do with people interacting with each other. So it's actually called interactionist theory, but you can still state that it's to do with interaction and people interacting with each other. So the theory states that people interact, those relationships that people form within society. It's just stating that that is something that happens, and then as a result, that interaction can influence involvement in participation in sport. So it's fairly simplistic, really. It's just saying that people interact, and that interaction can then lead to involvement or participation or lack of those things in terms of sport. So 2 key parts there. Make sure you've got those noted down and you're just clear about it. Just go over it in your head before we move on. Social action theory, 2 key elements: 1, people interacting; 2, the fact that that interaction can then lead to or influence participation in sport. So why is this important? This is the key thing here. So what's the relevance of this in terms of sport? Well, The first part is that people can intervene in social processes. Social processes is just a complicated way of saying how things develop and the progressions that take place. A progression is just a process of gradually developing things towards it getting better or a more advanced way of doing it. So social processes, how people intervene in those and then potentially change them. The second part is that for an example that you might give is in a more general look at it in terms of society, a protest against the norm. So a norm is just something that's considered normal, hence the name, in order to make a difference. So for instance, a protest against something which is considered normal and you're looking to make a difference. As a result of that, if that social action that people are taking against the norm gathers momentum, more people will get involved in it, momentum grows, support for it can grow, and on the back of that, a change is then made. So just let's go through that again, just so people are crystal clear. So there's two key elements to social action theory. Just pause the video here, make sure you're clear on that. Just say them out loud. What are the two key things without just reading them off the screen? What are the two key elements? Social action theory is to do with what? And then as a result of that, what does that influence? That's what you've got to be clear on. Okay, two key parts. It's to do with interaction, and it's on the back of that interaction that influences and affects involvement and participation in sport. The reasons why that's important is because through that interaction and through that change that people work towards, things can develop. And an example of that is where people come together based on an idea that they have and essentially protest and campaign against what is considered to be a norm in order to make a difference. And as the ball gets rolling and momentum builds, that's when changes then happen. That would be an example of social action theory in play in society. So, can you think of any examples of social action theory in society? Doesn't necessarily at this stage have to do with sport, although we will look at some examples to do with sport. Can you think of just general examples in society where an idea someone has had about something that needs potentially to change has gathered support, gained momentum, and off the back of that, there's been a change that's then occurred? Have a think, maybe pause the video, do a little bit of research. There are plenty of examples out there where this sort of thing has happened. So for example, one more recent and linked to sport is the work of Marcus Rashford and the way that he went about campaigning for an extension and an improvement to the provision of free school meals. And initially that got knocked back, but he didn't step away from the challenge there. And as it gained momentum and gained support, he was then able to actually action a change at a really, really high level across the whole country to ensure that young people who needed that support were actually given it. That's a perfect example of social action theory, where he's kind of campaigned against the norm. It's gathered momentum, people have started to support it, and as a result, something has changed. So that might spin a few plates in your head. What other things can you think of that might have been like that? This one might not be quite so obvious if it's not so linked to sport, but again, it's an idea that it's a campaign, it's a protest, it's a way of telling people in power that someone's not happy with something. And in this case, it was an example of where young people are being essentially just held in these camps and treated as terrorists or prisoners. And actually, they're just refugees who had no real option other than to be there to escape from where they were previously. Another good one, just a general one, obviously not linked to sport, but is to do with things like same-sex marriages. So that was something that wasn't considered possible just a few years ago, and now increasingly around the world. That is something that, due to the campaigning and due to the social action that people have taken, that is now something that people are able to, enjoy and benefit from because of the social action that people had taken. Right, now we've got to maybe think of a few more to do with actual links to sport. So can you think of some of those examples? Now you've got an idea of what it's all about. Can you think of some that might have been applied to sport in terms of maybe some level of inequality that was present, and a social action that took place to make sure that inequality was countered? Take a minute to think of some examples. So one good example is to do with skiing. So if you think of skiing, that was essentially the kind of the more old school way of getting down the slopes. But as a result of social action, snowboarding came. So it developed as a result of the social action when groups of people decided they didn't want to ski anymore, and they wanted to use a board. And as it gained more popularity and approval in kind of the various social circles and organizations, it grew as a sport, and now is a sport in its own right. But snowboarding didn't used to be a thing. It was only as a result of social action theory where people weren't happy with the norm, and through the social action there was a change that was made. This is a key point that I want you to note down. This is an example of a change in sport to match social needs. So it's important that you're clear on the two key elements of what social action theory is, and you kind of get the idea. It's to do with interaction, and it's to do with, where are we? Interaction, and it's to do with the influence that can then have on participation. You need to understand about why it's important, and protesting against those norms. But you also need to be clear on the distinction between two examples, or two types of examples. One of them is to do with changes in sport to match social needs. And then if we can think of any other examples, maybe these ones are more to do with the equality, like I was saying previously, things like this. So equal prize money in tennis, whereas previously men used to earn a lot more money in their prize money. That's no longer the case. It's now certainly at the Grand Slams, so the four majors, the US Open, Roland Garros in France, Australian Open and Wimbledon, prize money is now equal. That's essentially as a result of social action theory and people campaigning that wasn't something that was right. Another one is maybe allowing women golfers at certain major clubs. Like this one is arguably one of the most prestigious clubs in the world. It's called St Andrews. It's where major competitions are held in golf. And up until very, very recently, women weren't allowed to play on the course. They weren't allowed in the clubhouse. And that's now changed. And that's changed due to social action theory. And then another one is maybe just to do with female referees. Again, not something up until fairly recently that was a thing. And then people actually thought, hang on a minute, there's no reason why female shouldn't be able to referee and officiate in high-level sport, and also do it during men's competitions. It's not just that they have their own thing, they can actually do it well and do it just as well as the men in the male competitions as well, so like really high-profile competitions. And the key thing you note down, these are examples of developing equality in sport. Developing equality in sport. So just to make the distinction, first one here, this is an example of just a change in sport to match social needs. You might be able to think of others where there's been a change in sport to match social needs, but as long as you've got one clear example there where a sport has been adapted based on social action that's taken place, maybe I was trying to think of others. I was thinking maybe something like cricket and the introduction of things like 2020 cricket. You know, that's partly down to media, but it's linked into the desire of people to want to see maybe a change in the game, because the traditional 5-day cricket is a little bit dry for some people, and they want to try and jazz it up and make it more interesting for players and spectators. So that could be another example, but that's an example of changing sport to match social needs, and these are examples of developing equality in sport. So slightly different. You've got to be clear on the distinction there. Right, now we hit the ground with some of these key terms. So that was one aspect of what we needed to look at, the social action theory. Now we need to dig a little bit deeper into some key terms that we might have touched on there. One of them, so the first one, equal opportunity. So make a note of these definitions as they come up. Equal opportunities is the right to access the same opportunities regardless of factors such as race, age, gender, mental or physical capability. Okay, those are examples of factors. You need to be very clear on the definition here, the right to access the same opportunities as other people, regardless of race, age, sex, mental or physical capability. Okay, second key term, prejudice. So prejudice is a form of unfavorable opinion of an individual, often based on inadequate facts. Just go over that again. I've highlighted this this middle part because it's that if you focus on that, that's what's going to help you understand the distinction between this term and another one that we're going to look at shortly. Prejudice is essentially it's an opinion. It's forming an unfavorable, so a slightly negative opinion of someone based on inadequate facts. It's not necessarily that lots of other people hold that opinion. It's not that you necessarily do anything about that opinion, but it's just holding that unfavorable opinion about someone, usually based on something that's inaccurate and inadequate in terms of its factual nature. So what I want you to think about is, can you identify examples of prejudice in either society or obviously more specifically for us to do with sport? Can you put a little list together of those examples? Just pause the video here and have a little think about that. Okay, so essentially what you're commenting on here is whether there's a lack of tolerance or a disliking of someone based on, you know, these key areas, these key kind of personal factors: race, religion, culture, sex, age, disability, class, any of those things. And that's taken directly from an exam answer where you're having to state what prejudice actually is. So it's a lack of tolerance or a disliking of someone based on those or any of those key things, not necessarily all of them, but any one, or it might be more than one, but any of those key things. So whatever your example is, as long as it fits in with that general theory there, examples of prejudice in society and sport: someone holding an opinion on someone based on the color of their skin, someone holding an opinion based on the religion, or just simply about of their sex or their age, that they're not able to do something, or they're not on the same level as someone else purely because of one of those things. That would be prejudice, where it's just an unfavorable opinion. Linked to that then very closely is discrimination. So we just need to make a note of this. And again, I've just highlighted a couple of key elements in the definition so you can see the distinction here. Discrimination is the unfair treatment of a person or a minority group to make a distinction and act on the prejudice. So it's the action that takes place. So usually, if you might be prejudiced, but you might not act on it. If you do act on it, it then becomes discrimination, because it's then an unfair treatment of someone or a group of people based on the prejudiced views that you hold. So the prejudice is just the opinion. The discrimination is the action or the treatment based on that opinion, based on that prejudice. So hopefully you can see the difference there. So based on what you'd said in your previous task where you've listed those examples of some prejudice in society or sport, can you then just add in for one or two of them, explain how these opinions might impact on participation in sport? So for instance, if the coach of a team has prejudiced views, how is that potentially going to impact on one or more of those groups that you'd looked at previously? It's not rocket science, but just take a couple of examples out there. Coach of a football team, if they had prejudiced views and then they were going to discriminate against that person, what would that actually mean for them? Essentially, it's just going to mean that there's going to be negative treatment of that performer. So from your previous list, it might mean that they're not able to take part. They're not part of the team. They're not given the same opportunities. They're treated differently, and that's the key thing. And it's purely based on this prejudice. But the discrimination is actually the action of or the treatment. So you actually you act on that opinion. Right. Next part of this is still based on discrimination. What we need to just think about here is what are the different ways in that in some social groups can be discriminated against in sport. So if you're thinking, maybe think of those different social groups, so whether it's women, whether it's elderly people, whether it's based on a disability, or the fact that someone comes from a minority ethnic group. What are the different ways within sport that these people could be discriminated against? Think of it, you could look at it from maybe a higher, like it could be at a low level, so for junior performers, or it could be at a slightly more higher level, working up towards elite performers, and some of the ways that they might struggle. What are some of the things that they might find as a challenge based on discrimination that they have to deal with? We'll deal with the second part to that in a minute, but just try and think about that in the first part. So what are the different ways that those social groups might be discriminated against in sport? So just to get the ball rolling, one way that they might be discriminated against is through stereotyping, and that's something that we're going to look at on the next slide, so just hold that thought. Another way might be to do with restrictions to do with membership. So, you're not allowed to join this club because of, and then a reason based on prejudice. So, for example, as ridiculous as it might seem, women might not be allowed to join the golf club. They might be really good at golf. They might be able to play better than some of the men that are playing, but up until very recently, there were still restrictions on members, female members, even at a really elite level, being able to join those golf clubs. And the same could be said for cricket clubs as well, and to a lesser extent, maybe things like tennis, where other groups might have had restricted access to either join the club or join the team. Fewer competitions might be available, limited access to coaching provision. So it's just, well, you can play at the club, but you can't be part of the coaching group. We're not going to, you're not going to be part of the training group here. It might be things to do with facilities. So it might be that things like creches aren't available for mothers to be able to go and take part in activities at a gym or a leisure centre and things like that. That's essentially a discrimination, discriminating against a group of people because of their social status. That's not okay. That they shouldn't be able to do that purely because they've got children. It might even be something more obvious, like if leisure centres and gyms don't have ramps, that's now seen as discrimination. You have to provide an opportunity for everyone to have that equal opportunity to take part. Just straight up racism, sexism, verbal abuse, so it's more obvious and in your face, which is what we're going to look at in a minute. Limited tournament earnings. So we mentioned about female tennis players at the Grand Slams only more recently getting complete equality in terms of earnings, but it might also impact on funding and sponsorship that's coming their way, where male counterparts or potentially even individuals, from whether it's to do with disability or an ethnic group or anything like that, it might actually be something like that that's the discrimination. And also it could be something to do with media coverage, so just limited media coverage for certain groups, such as women in football, such as disabled athletes, things like that is actually discrimination. And the distinction, you might just need to just do a quick bit of research on this, but these key terms here, overt and discrete discrimination, just take a minute just to maybe find out what those actually mean, and then we can just clarify which ones of these are considered overt and which ones are discrete. So in a nutshell, overt, and just make a note of this if you haven't managed to find it, overt discrimination is the more obvious, visible form of discrimination. So it could be things like that verbal racist abuse of someone, so someone shouting something out, whether that's from spectators or whether God forbid it's coaches and managers treating people like that, but that is considered overt, so it's more obvious. So things like the racism and the sexism and the verbal abuse, that's overt discrimination. Discrete is the opposite, so discrete is where it's hidden, it's less obvious. So examples of that where if someone's just not getting selected regularly in the team, or not given responsibility as a captain, purely because of their race or their religion or something like that, that would be discrete. It's not quite as obvious as the overt one. So if you think of the overt for obvious, and the discrete is the less one, less obvious, so it's hidden, and it might not be quite so obvious to see. Okay, so it's important that you're just clear on those with those examples of types of stereotyping. Right, the next bit is to do with, as I said, stereotypes. So we mentioned it on one kind of way that someone could be discriminated against is through stereotyping, and it's important that you're just clear on the distinction here between the prejudice and discrimination and stereotyping. So stereotyping is essentially, it's a shared image, it's a simplistic generalization, and it's a judgment of a group of people. It's very similar to prejudice, but prejudice is an opinion that you alone potentially might hold. A stereotype is a more general judgment that's maybe cast slightly wider than just an individual opinion. So what I want you to think about is identify examples of stereotypes in society, and obviously more specifically to do with sport. So how are these stereotypes, how these stereotypes might impact on participation in sport? Now, in some of these, I'll be honest, you might be thinking some of them are a little uncomfortable to go through, but just think it through, even though we're now smart enough to realize that a lot of these things are ridiculous, but just go through some of the generalizations that you might have heard in terms of sports participation and which groups may be better, which groups may be better suited to certain sports, that sort of thing. I've put one example here, whether you've seen the film or not, White Men Can't Jump, related to basketball, and it's a common kind of stereotype now, because it's not accurate, but it's just a stereotype. It's a shared simplistic generalization based on race, which isn't actually accurate. So essentially what you're saying here is, in terms of its impact, is it leads to negative treatment of performers from minority groups. That's going to be the overall impact of having these stereotypes. So it might be that they're not able to take part regularly. It might be that they're not given the same opportunities. But we'll just dig a little bit deeper into this. So one example of stereotyping might be to do with like the myth of being whether individuals are suited or potentially not suited to certain kinds of sport. So just to kind of stir the pot a little bit here, have a think which group of people stereotypically are best suited to cricket, which group are the best sprinters, which group are the best badminton racket sports players, which group are the best table tennis players. So these are stereotypes. It doesn't make it accurate, but you might have heard people from India and Pakistan are always going to be the best cricketers. Afro-Caribbean people are always going to be the best sprinters. Asian people are always really good at badminton. Chinese people are always good at table tennis. Those are all stereotypes. Just because you're Chinese, it doesn't mean that you're good at table tennis. Just because you're from India, it doesn't mean that you're immediately very good at cricket. It's a stereotype. And equally, you've got to think, based on those stereotypes, which sports are this group's not well suited to. So if it was a stereotype, so yeah, you might think the stereotype is that all Indian people are good at cricket. Well, what sport what is the stereotype that Indian people are maybe not good at? What sports are Afro-Caribbean people considered not to be good at as a stereotype? What about the badminton players, Asian players? Oh, they're good at badminton, but can't play football, can't play rugby. Chinese people, oh, they're all good at table tennis, but can't do what? Can't play basketball. So they're all stereotypes. So other things to consider here. It might be that stereotypes are directed into where people are directed into certain sports at a really young age. Now, often these stereotypes are talked about from an early age. And as a result of that, young people are maybe driven in towards sports that, oh, because you're a young Asian lad, then maybe you're better off not getting involved in football, because what are your chances are that you're going to be good at football just because you're from India? It's a stereotype. It's nonsense, and but that might be something that's taken place previously. Equally, oh, you're a girl, you can't play football. You're a girl, you can't play rugby. So they're directed in, oh, you should do gymnastics or netball. It's a stereotype. It might also be that they're considered less capable than others in an ethnic group of succeeding in the more administrative, high-level areas of, so not just performers, but actually at the kind of governance and organisation stage of a sport. And I've put a link to 3 key things here. And what I want you to do is for each one, just click on the link, and then there's it just takes you to a fairly brief article on 3 key things that are linked to stereotypes here. What I want you to do is just produce a little summary of each article. It shouldn't take long. Just a few key bullet points outlining, what are the key points that you could take out from each one. One's to do with something called the Rooney Rule, which hopefully you'll have a better understanding of once you've read the article. One's to do with people in positions of authority in terms of governing bodies. And I think it's specifically looking at the FA for the Football Association, and one's to do with the limited opportunities for black managers in football in England. So yeah, just take a second just to go through each of those. Don't rush it, because this is pretty much the end of this presentation and one of the key tasks here. So take a bit of time just to go through each one, try and summarize. You can use bullet points, but let's look for maybe at least 5 bullet points that you could just pick out of key points to take from each article. Have the kind of have a subheading for each article. So for instance, the Rooney Rule, national governing bodies and managerial positions, and then aim for 5 bullet points under each one. And just on an aside from that, the final point here is that potentially individuals are not given central roles in sports teams. So that is on the back of stereotyping. So things like, it's probably something that's a little bit more seen in America, but can you think, what example can you think of an American sport where it's very much a stereotype that certain individuals are not suited to a particular position? So it's often something that's thrown out there, that the quarterback in an American football team is always a white guy, and that it's a central position in a team. It's linked to this term called stacking. So stacking is to do with positioning players in certain positions purely, but essentially based on stereotypes. So you've got to have the white guy as the quarterback, and you've got to have the Afro-American guys, like the big black guys, you have on as wide receivers, for instance, because they're fast and strong. It's because it's such a common thing, people kind of don't look past it. But there are exceptions to that rule that are coming through now. But that's what that essentially means. So stacking is to do with positioning people in certain positions within the squad or the team purely based on a stereotype, and it's linked into this stereotypical view that people in decision-making roles within the teams are not well suited to certain groups, and that's a ridiculous stereotype, but that's something that is still an issue in lots of sports, particularly in some like big American sports. So that's the presentation. Okay, make sure that you spend a decent amount of time going through these 3 articles and making a summary of those points, and then I look forward to seeing what you can come up with when you send me the work. Okay, guys, take it easy. All the best. Bye bye.